Our research question is how have the treatment and attitudes towards Edward Colston's statue? Bristol has a long and complex history of slavery, and its past has not always been well acknowledged by the city. There have been many attempts to bring attention to the city's history and how it is represented, as well as change this representation of the history. One of the key parts of this is the statue of Edward Colston, which was standing in the city centre until recently. Edward Colston was born in Bristol and was a 17th century slave trader. He was the deputy governor of the Royal African Company, which between 1672 and 1698 transported over 100,000 enslaved people. It is estimated that Colston is responsible for the deaths of over 30,000 people, including people who died during the slave raids and on the slave ships during transportation. During his lifetime, Colston donated a lot of money to Bristol, including founding Colston Boys' School, and although Colston died in 1721, it wasn't until 1895 that the statue of him was built and put on display to the public. Building the statue was first suggested by a wealthy businessman named James Smith in 1893. There have been many unsuccessful attempts to remove the Colston statue over the years, such as bringing his past as a slave trader to public attention and petitions. Instead of having the statue on display on the streets, some people wanted it moved into a museum, which would mean the city is acknowledging its history of slavery without celebrating Colston.
To formulate ideas, we decided to begin with a mind map of the rabbit holes we had found ourselves interested in since the beginning of the module. This allowed us to see how we could refine our key themes into more specific and targeted questions. We decided to explore the general idea of power in relation to Colston's statue and found ourselves interested in the contrast between the council and the public. We began our research by revisiting the material from the forced labour section of the module, in particular the material from week 3, where we watched the Colston Falls film. Our interest in the film then led us to discover further articles, websites and readings, for example the Telegraph article written by Robert Mendick in 2017, outlining the decision to change the name of the music venue Colston Hall. This led us to discover how the City Council considered and responded to these opinions regarding Colston's representation in the city. Following the field class where we visited the People's Plinth, we decided to explore a wide range of secondary data sources to investigate our question, including council documents and meeting notes to see their response to the public calls for action, newspaper articles to explore actions and attitudes of different groups to the treatment of the statue when events unfolded, as well as interviews, social media sites and petitions to further understand the public opinions. We used Richard Andrews' book, Research Questions, to guide us in refining our question. He points to 2 main factors in creating a successful research question. The first is ensuring that the question is manageable, meaning that it can be answered in the course of the research project, and workable, meaning that it is of a sufficient scale to be appropriate for the project in hand. The second is ensuring that the question is answerable with the resources and timescale at our disposal. The second is potentially less significant for our question, as we will not actually be answering the question. However, it was an important consideration to make sure that our question was suitable. Having considered these factors, we reached the question, how have the treatments and attitudes towards Edward Colston's statue by the Bristol City Council differed to those of the public?
When starting to think about the question, we first looked into initial public attitudes and actions towards the Colston statue through looking into the Black Lives Matter movement in the city prior to the events on the 7th of June 2020. We started by first researching the existence of petitions to remove Colston and their success with both the public and the council. Therefore, through a primary Google research, we quickly discovered a vast range of petitions, each supporting different attitudes and arguments towards the removal of the statue. This led us to Will Penrose's petition on change.org, which called for the removal of the statue. The petition started prior to the events gained major movement, deepening our insight into public attitudes. However, when looking at these different petitions, it was apparent that Bristol City Council did not address any petitions prior to the protest, with there being no record publicly available of any discussions in meeting records or notes. Therefore, in order to answer the question, we would dive deeper into finding out about the council's attitudes to the initial calls for action through contacting council members to inquire about why petitions were not addressed, as well as inquiring more into how the council decision-making process occurs, allowing us to gain an insight into how the council would make a final outcome on the future of the statue.
In order to explore the question further, we examined newspaper articles from June 2020, the time that Colston's statue was pulled down, and during the wider BLM protests in Bristol. This was an important step as newspaper and articles from Bristol Post, Bristol Live, and The Guardian were able to give us a good bed of knowledge. Had we looked to answer the question, we would have built upon the foundation that these secondary sources gave us by gathering primary data during the event. There are numerous ways to do this, with the Colston Falls video being a good example of this. Nevertheless, we would have gone onto social media to examine public opinion and first-hand reporting of the event to try and gather opinions on the BLM protests. We used the field trip to broaden our knowledge and understanding of the event, which helped us to gather more information on the June 2020 protests. After that, we looked into different interviews whereby protesters had provided their first-hand accounts of what happened during the events. For example, we noticed that the BBC interviewed many people about the event, with Angel Mel, a protester, stating that the toppling of Colston's statue allowed her to reclaim her identity. We also looked at online petitions and what the council's reaction was to the toppling of the statue and why it was so unpopular. We found that Rees's reason for not taking the statue down was because the council were more focused on tackling the issues that directly affected the black and minority ethnic community in Bristol every day, rather than simply removing the statue, which was seen as sentimental. We would then look at both the council and the public opinions during the event from the primary and secondary sources in order to come up with a judgment related to the question. The primary qualitative data in particular would aid our understanding of the question, as we would compare and contrast the different responses to see exactly how the treatment and attitudes towards the statue differed between the council and the public.
We then thought about how exploring the differences between the council's and the public's treatments and attitudes towards the statue following its removal could help us to answer our question. When searching for resources we could use, we started with a brief search of the Bristol City Council website using relevant terms such as Colston in the website search engine. In doing so, we discovered that the Mayor, Marvin Reed, set up the We Are Bristol History Commission in September 2020 after Edward Colston's statue was removed. The Commission aims to first discuss the future of the statue before moving on to tackle broader problems within Bristol, including the history of slavery and protests. To look at the public's perspective, we noticed whilst exploring our individual rabbit holes differences in public opinion surrounding the erection of a statue called A Surge of Power depicting Jen Reed, a BLM protester, and its rapid removal by the council. This links well to survey data we encountered in the end shed during the Bristol field trip, showing the different reactions of the public to the removal of Colston's statue. In order to answer the question, we would examine the publicly available notes of 6 of the We Are Bristol History Commission meetings and use newspapers containing insight into public opinion and data from the M Shed. We could also conduct primary research by interviewing people in the streets of Bristol about their opinions on the toppling of Colston's statue over a year later. In summary, we believe this group project has advanced our understanding of how to formulate better quality research questions and how we can go about answering them. After developing our initial line of inquiry with a mind map of our individual ideas and opinions from previous rabbit hole work, we used this and what we had read in Richard Andrews' book to develop our question. We then decided to tackle the question by researching secondary sources from before the BLM movement in Bristol, during the protest and after the statue was toppled, focusing within each timeframe on the public and the council. From our own research, we identified secondary data we could use, such as petition data, newspaper articles, social media posts, data collected by the NSHED and council meeting notes. We also formed ideas for primary data collection, such as surveys and street interviews. We would use both types of data to compare the behaviour towards and treatment of the statue over time by both the council and the public in order to come to a conclusion.